We are live now on the Conversations That Matter podcast. I'm your host, John Harris, and we're continuing a discussion of this book, Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver, written in 1948, if you can believe it. Yeah, and you have your copy too. Same copy. We're going to, I see, actually, I have 3 copies. I don't know how many you have. I have the Audible, I have the Kindle, and I have the hard copy, which I think this might be the only book I have 3 copies in every format that I can possibly have. That's how important the book is to me, I guess. But anyway, we're going to talk about the book a little more today. It says that we have one person watching. I don't know if usually if I start a live stream, there's like at least like 50 people. So
that's me.
That's you. You're the now there's 7. That's interesting. I don't know what's going on. Maybe the algorithm is set weird. We'll see what happens as we continue the podcast. But we're going to go over a bunch of stuff today. And I know my dad might join us, but for those who don't know, who weren't here last time, my brother David is going to be joining us for this discussion. He's a school teacher down in Tennessee. He has taught high school history and ESL, it's English as a second language. And his degree is his bachelor's degree. Actually, is it your bachelor's or your master's that's in English?
I have a bachelor's degree in English literature with a minor in linguistics, and I have a master's of science in education, specializing in teaching English as a second language to speakers of other languages. So I'm a specialist.
Well, I was actually hoping that you would give some of that insight that you have on linguistics for the chapter that we're going to be talking about language, because some of it's kind of thick, and it's, the whole book is somewhat thick for someone who's just used to reading your average Christian books, that, pop books or whatever. This is going to be a hard read, and you might have to take it slower, but that chapter on linguistics, I think, is especially difficult. So we'll be picking your brain when we get there. So people are saying things in the chat. You might not want to look at it. They're saying things like Gordon. I don't know what that means. We'll just ignore that. Yeah, I don't know who Gordon is.
All right, let's be a thing that comes up every time we do this.
It's weird. It's strange. I'm going to pull up a summation I prepared. And by the way, if you're a Patron, you'll have access to this. These are slides just summarizing each chapter, and there'll be reference points for our discussion, if I can pull it up. So in the meantime, how's your day going?
It's not quite over yet, but long, very, very long. I started a new part-time position, tutoring 4th graders in math today. So I stay longer, and I get to work with numbers instead of syllables and words for a little bit.
Do you like that better or worse?
I don't know if it's better or worse. It's just nice to have a break when you're trying to teach people how to speak English. You kind of do a lot of the very same rudimentary things all day long. So it's nice to have something that challenges you a little bit. In 4th grade math, I actually find very challenging. So it works out.
Well, Richard Weaver would say that that's not those aren't the disciplines that we need right now, but they are. I mean, he says to combat modernity, which we'll get to at the end. The present state that we're in, we need an education of, he calls it logic and dialectic, right? Is one part. And then the humanities, I think, in history, something like that, which, is interesting because all the engineers are like, wait, well, why not our field? And he seems to think that it's the application of this idea that everything can be engineered, right? That is part of the problem.
You remember in Dutchess, we took that, everybody took that class, social problems. And you remember one of the views, like the 3 views, there's 3 views of the world. One is,
I still remember this. That's so weird. Yeah.
Do you remember what they were? There was 3 of them.
But yeah, there was Marxist theory. There was this is what they told every incoming freshman. It was Marxist theory, symbolic interactionism, right? And then structural functionalism. How the world do I remember that? That's weird.
I remember it too, but because I thought structural functional, yeah, that makes sense. That's well, the society is a machine, and like there's a piece missing, which is kind of what he describes in chapter 5. But then the other one was social conflict, which was basically just Marxism, which is communism. And then the other one was symbolic interactionism. And I kind of realized over the course of the semester, if you said, well, I'm a symbolic interactionist, it meant nothing, and it just meant like, well, everything is on like an individual level, and you could kind of like, that was the option if you didn't want to argue with like Marxists or
Right.
whatever structural functionalists. So that was fun.
I think I like the structural functionalism as I remember, but I was like, none of these are really Christian. So
Yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, I'm uploading it right now, so you'll all be able to see this in a minute. But let me just start with let's review. So we only went over 3 chapters last time in this book. We did chapter 1, the unsentimental sentiment, chapter 2, the distinction and hierarchy, and then chapter 3, fragmentation and obsession. And I don't know if that we can summarize everything we talked about, but in fact, I'll let David do that since it's such an easy job now. I think overall, I think we sort of landed on that hierarchy's been diminished, that we can see evidences for the giving up of these transcendentals, as Richard Weaver calls them, but this idea that there's objective standards or categories of thought and being, and that we're all kind of lost at sea. And he makes these amazing predictions about what schools are going to be like, what society is going to be like, what it already was. Well, some of it was happening in his day, but it reads like a newspaper. Some of it, you're just amazed to find some of the insights he had. And so his thesis is that this philosophy called nominalism, this and I give it kind of a pop summary, but this overturning of the idea that there's these categories, that being is intrinsic to the object. So this drove man to try to find meaning inside of him instead of out there, right? That has been pretty much has developed and become the main problem in Western civilization. And I would agree with them. I think we could express it theologically with man wanting to be God, this Babel instinct that man has to come together and reach the heavens. But Weaver looks at it in a philosophical way, and approaching the problem the way Weaver does, I think, can really expand our understanding as Christians. And it helps me at least understand the world I live in better and apply scripture to the things that I'm seeing, because I understand better. I think I have better insight into what I'm seeing. So, David, you want to give any summation of what we talked about last time, or do you think mine was fair enough?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty good. Hierarchy is big, and then also there's a lot of talk about specialization. So, like, how do you get how is the idea of hierarchy undermined? Over the last few hundred years, I guess. He's definitely very strong. Weaver's very strong in linking to the like medieval scholastics. So one question that I kind of was putting in my mind as I went through is, what exactly like does he see as the idealized time? And he seems to definitely like, he kind of, it's like it's pre-Renaissance. That seems to be kind of where he wants to go. And he talks a lot about the Greek. I mean, especially more in chapters like 5 and 6, but we've gotten away from a sense of hierarchy, and I think if you had to boil down, it is a stream of consciousness book, so it's not organized in the same way that a regular book would be organized necessarily. But if you had to like give a summation, we're sort of apart, like we live lives apart, kind of like fragmented, I guess would be the word that he would use, because of our loss of belief and confidence in something like a reality, a metaphysical reality, something beyond the drab lives that we inhabit. And so he has all these different, reasons why it's gotten that way. And the one that jumped out to me the most was specialization, because of my own career and where I've seen that. But yeah. So we've lost hierarchy and we're fragmented because of it.
Well, let's pick it up where we left off. This is the summation I have of chapter 4. I'm just going to read this to you, and then we'll talk about it. And we're going to go through 5 chapters today. So we'll go a little quicker. And then if there are people who want to weigh in, We will take comments and calls from patrons. And then, of course, if you want to weigh in, leave a comment in the chat, let us know you're here. And we will try to address whatever's in the chat.
Before
So,
you go in, I think
yeah.
somebody's trying to get in.
Someone's trying to get in
Yeah.
to the. Oh, no. I think that's someone who maybe later on is going to join us for
No,
discussion.
I think we're related to this person.
Are they really trying to get in? Are you getting?
I was just asked, have you been let into the streaming yet?
Oh, huh. Well, you could probably tell that person that it's live right now, and the link. In fact, if you have the link, you can resend it.
Okay, I'll send it
while I'm going over this.
Okay.
So, chapter 4, egotism in art and work. Weaver argues that in the pursuit of freedom from standards, man withdraws from the spiritual community, which leads to increasing selfishness, pride, and manipulation. The resulting egoists subordinate ends to themselves instead of themselves to ends, meaning purposes. They don't subordinate themselves to the purpose they're created for. Instead, they try to make everything in creation suit their needs or their wants, their desires. People resent work because there is no desire to please their bosses, who are no better morally than them, and they are engaged in satisfying consumer demands instead of producing quality. This has taken a toll in art, as evidenced by the Romantics, who denied original sin and revolted against intellect, the sentimental comedy, which reduced evil to mistakes, the Expressionists, who revolted against convention, turning inward, Impressionism, that assumed outline did not exist in nature, musical forms like jazz with its lack of restraint. This is where David's going to be mad.
I have a lot to say
Climax
about that
without
when we get there.
climax without titillation, and reward without work. In each case, private experience determined reality, and transcendentals were denied. Weaver encourages a return to viewing work as a divine ordinance with purpose and quality. So this is such an applicable thing. This is so important for Christians living their lives, going about their day, and wondering, what's the point? I get up and I go to work, and whatever you are, you work in a factory, you work as a teacher, whatever system you're part of. What's the significance of that? Weaver says that we've lost some significance. There's something missing. And I think I can sense it around us, right? What do you think, Dave?
100%. I mean, the example I think he uses in chapter 4 is, I'm blanking if this is chapter 4 or 3. I think it's chapter 4, is working on the nuclear project, which
Manhattan Project, yeah.
Yeah, so I live about 40 minutes from where they created that city now. It's Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And it's a fascinating place. I mean, they basically built an entire city that was secret. People didn't really know that it existed. In fact, just a little side note, the Oak Ridge Boys actually got their name because they were a gospel quartet that would be contracted to come in and sing and do live entertainment for all the people who were living there in secret. But his example, anyways, that's not really pertinent, but
they weren't jazz, so they were fine. They weren't jazz.
Yeah, it was gospel. They were, gospel while they were creating something that would wipe out hundreds of thousands of people. So his point basically is that, anybody who would have, if there were people who were, I don't know, sweeping the floors of the factory, for example. So anybody who had a small contribution to this overarching project, well, nobody really, if they would have maybe if they would have realized the weight of what was going on there, like what the actual consequence of using this weapon would be, maybe they wouldn't have been okay with it, I guess, which we could debate whether or not that was justified action, which we probably would debate, but
yeah, Weaver doesn't seem to think it is, but
he definitely doesn't think it is, because I mean, that's at least the sense that you get. But the point, and you could apply this to so many different inventions, so many different. I think of all the people that work in tech, because it's they're good paying jobs, but you have a little piece of that thing that you do. You're specialized in this one particular area. Your job is to, I think the example last week I was using was writing code. So like your example, your purpose is to write code. right? And you don't give any thought to really what is outside of, like what you're contributing to on a grander scale, right? So I think some careers, probably it's easier to fall into that than others, because some careers you kind of see that, like you see the fruits of your labor, or you see exactly what your work means right in front of you. If you're a cop, right, you have a pretty specific job. Your job is to go out and keep things safe and to get home safely, and that's if those two things were accomplished, you kind of had success in your position. But the overwhelming majority of like careers, of jobs that we have, are, you play a very small part in a very sort of grand, in a big babel, kind of. And it's not
Right.
to say that, obviously, from Christmas perspective, that you can't honor and serve the Lord in those, like Luther said, a milkmaiden milks to the glory of God. But on a societal level, if like in a zoomed out view, you lose your meaning. You lose the meaning in your work. You're not working. I guess we'll get into that a little bit more in this chapter, but I don't want to get ahead of us. But
Well, I don't want to spend a long time on each chapter since we have 5 of them, but the very title itself, egoism in art and work. He says at the end, he goes, egotism in work and art is the flowering after long growth of a heresy about human destiny. That's pretty drastic language there. Its abhorrence of discipline and form is usually grouped with the signs of progress. It is progress for those who neither have a sense of direction nor want responsibility. The heresy is that man's destiny in the world is not to perfect himself, but to lean back in sensual enjoyment. Indeed, there is something expressive of both the philosophy and technique of artistic impressionism. So he goes on talking about, he gives all these other examples from his time of the art and the way work was viewed. One of the things I thought was interesting is, the Norman Rockwell painting, The Four Freedoms, right?
yeah,
Freedom from want, etc. Right? He says programs like The Four Freedoms, with their vague political unrealism, instead of helping the situation, serve only to codify error. It is the presumption of egotism which renders people unfit for the philosophic anarchy they appear to think of. And so, anyways, let me read this one last sentence, then we'll comment. An ancient axiom of politics teaches that a spoiled people invite despotic control. In other words, he's saying something that Francis Schaeffer actually said. He says tyranny is on the horizon, guys. It's coming. And this is what happens. And you can see it in the art, and you can see it in the work that people do. Craftsmanship has been being destroyed. People aren't taking pride in their work. They're not looking at it and saying, I'm going to put my name on this. I'm going to put it out there because this is something that is, it glorifies my creator. It's what I was meant to do. It's part of my design. I'm trying to match something in the created order. I'm trying to be the best version of myself, right? None of that. Instead, I think what's happened is that people are like, let me go to my job, which is from 9 to 5, and I'll work that job, and I don't care about what I do during the day. Like, in fact, I'm going to try to be as unproductive as I possibly can be, because my whole goal in being here is I want to buy stuff. I want to have video games, or I want to have, a lifestyle of entertaining myself. And I want to provide that maybe for my family too. But that's like a completely different way of viewing work. It's not a calling anymore. There's no purpose in it. It's not an end in and of itself. It's a means to an end, and that end is now gratifying yourself. It's egotism, right? It's all centered on you, and he says the same thing's happening just all over the place, happening in politics. The Four Freedoms is an example of that, where now we're going to change what freedom is. It's no longer, or liberty. It's not a gate that the government cannot trespass into your private life, because that's your responsibility. That's not what it is anymore. Freedom from the government, that the government won't go across that gate. Now we say, government, jump over the gate. And while you're jumping over, though, please bring me something good. Be Santa Claus and bring me stuff from my neighbor's yard, because the gate that you're jumping, over to get into my yard is paralleling my neighbor's. And if you bring some of his stuff to my house, I'll thank you for it. So freedom from want means that's redistribution. That's taking from others. But it's justified now because of egotism. And so he says, once you get rid of these transcendentals, once you get rid of these objective truths, the way that we're supposed to live in nature that God created. And it all becomes a meaning, and everything else is found inside you. This is part of the consequence of that. So, and it looks like our father has joined the stream, so we're going to put him. Although, let's see. All we see is the fireplace in that shot. So
Wow,
maybe you want to move the camera a little bit. I don't think I can move it from here. I'm new to this format. But so David, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I kind of applied it to my own career because so in the teaching field, which is a fairly broad like career area, but I have a very specific function, right? I work. I mean, it's a like.
I think the camera fell over.
Upside down. We need to get some specialization over there to Wappenders. So within.
I mean, I could kick you out of the chat and let you come back in, or we could just watch. Okay. We could get a tour of the whole room. Okay. So everyone can see.
Refinished 1700s, early 1700s farmhouse.
Yeah.
So now we're sideways.
Well, yeah. Continue making your point.
Okay. So, yeah. So, I mean, you can definitely see this in the world of art. I'll talk about teaching later. So, art has gotten so pigeonholed into individualistic expression, and whatever it is. I mean, it could be literature, it could be, it could be painting, it could be. I think music is actually a particularly good example because music has gotten so like it's all kind of become the same thing. So country, R&B, pop, whatever it is, it's kind of the same beats, similar progressions, but usually like the themes are very they're very egotistical. They become an expression of my feeling, my this is me, this is what I like to do, and that's really the main theme. It's when you hear something that is outside of that theme, it sounds very refreshing. But that would be the crossover into art. So you especially hear that. I mean, like we grew up listening to country music, so you've really gotten that in the last few decades with country because it's, hey, this is my life, this is the way I like to live. This is whereas you used to have really, really like profound kind of stories and themes, and there was usually a lot of like Christian ethic that was mixed in. So I don't know. I think you could pick really any art medium, and you can see that kind of playing out in real time.
Yeah, no, that's a good point with the music, because he's talking about jazz back in the 40s and how it's. I think one of his main complaints, this is how I view it at least, is that in classical music there's so much dynamics. There's a build up. I mean, for those who we just had Christmas last month. The Hallelujah chorus. You don't just listen to the Hallelujah chorus, right? That you have to listen to Handel's Messiah, and I've seen a live production of this, and it builds up to the Hallelujah chorus, and it makes it that much more satisfying. You're just waiting for it when it comes. And he says jazz gives you this instant gratification. It doesn't have the same structure to it. There aren't rules, right? That's the whole idea of jazz, that there aren't rules. It's just whatever feels good. And so anyway, I think if he could see what you're talking about today, with every genre has been sort of permeated by this hormone culture where it's not even real culture. It's not even people who are talking about the life they live. I mean, they are to some extent, but they're not talking about the things that make their region significant, or their family, or what they enjoy, things about God's creation that are unique or significant. Instead, it's all hormones. It's all just party till you can't party anymore, drink as much as you want to drink. And then even the music is structured that way. And I don't believe in a devil's chord. I'm not saying this is like it's evil in and of itself. There's no like devil's beat or note, but there is a like the purpose of that so often I think is for dance clubs. It's for people to express themselves in very sensual ways. and that's the only flavor that makes it to like the top 40, it seems, right?
So I think
So
if I could just give like a quick the jazz issue. So because if people have read it, that section is very confusing. I remember Dad saying he was trying to figure out like what is his issue with jazz. So in the context of, I think you're muted, Dan. In the context of
I unmuted him.
when he, can you hear us?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So in the context of when he's writing that, exactly what you're talking about, hormone culture, that would be jazz. That would be represented by jazz music, right? This is the late 40s. So, what is our, I don't know, dance club, hyper over sexualized kind of music that you might imagine today, which now is just like mainstream music. Back then, that would be best represented in jazz culture, because jazz culture that's the music you're dancing to. That's your clubbing music of the late 1940s. To put that into perspective, in the 1950s, there were more people who attended like concerto, orchestral music than there were going to baseball games. So the culture was more cultured, if you want to use that terminology. So jazz, though, I had an experience a few years ago. I love jazz. I'm a big jazz person. A few years ago, I went to a concert in Philadelphia to see a fairly prominent jazz musician. But I didn't really know his music. So I listened to a little bit before we went to the concert. I was like, I don't know, this is okay. So then when we got there, he explained, he said, well, I play easy jazz. So I didn't know what easy jazz was, but it was strange because like there was a drummer, there was a bassist, a saxophonist, and a guitar player, electric guitar player. And they seemed to kind of be playing around with each other a little bit with melodies and syncopation, but it just seemed like they would just take turns completely grandstanding. I mean, the main guy was a trumpet player, so he's just going, he's going real crazy, and like, but it was so like the whole purpose was to showcase, man, look how good I am. But because they weren't playing in unison, it sounded like kind of like noise. So when I did a little bit more research, I found so easy jazz was actually what was just coming up, kind of what he's responding to. Easy jazz was taking off in the late 40s, and it was, if you take jazz all the way back to its origins, really like Dixieland. So that's kind of where it comes from. New Orleans, everybody playing a bunch of brass, but you're playing actual melodies. You are getting somewhere, but over the course of like 40 years. From when it first developed in the early 1900s, it had become a much more egotistical music. Now it's gone completely crazy, and like if you listen to a lot of modern jazz, it just sounds kind of lame. Now I would argue in the midst of that there was some real genius and brilliance going on, but that's partially because I like jazz and I am looking for some reason to defend it. But yeah, a little bit.
When it comes to like even the church, though, Christianity, I think you see these same trends because these forces that Weaver's talking about that affect all these industries. It's not like Christian ministries are exempt from these forces necessarily just because they're Christian. And
well, you do see that in Christian music as well. If you were going to go on with the music, because I mean. The same trends have been reflected in the church. I would even argue you kind of even see it with like the conservative, what would you call it? Modern hymnology, I guess. And I'm not to, a lot of that stuff is really, really great. And we sing those songs and everything, but where you kind of get to where everything just becomes kind of the same. Like, you could sit down and write one of those songs fairly easily. The problem with pop Christian music, right, is it's become egotistical too. It's all about me. It's about
totally, yeah. That's what I was. Yeah, that's perfect example of it. That the egotism has completely invaded the forms of worship that Christians use so often, and so it's not about if you open a hymnal, read some old hymns, and then look at the top 10 songs, let's say, that are being sung in churches, and you're going to notice a huge difference. And the main one is what Weaver's talking about right in this chapter, that it's instant gratification. It's very focused on the self and how it feels and just trying to be in tune with feeling. And you have feeling in old hymns, but it's very structured. It's orderly. It's to conform oneself to a higher order, to God's will. And it's focused on that order. It's focused on God. It's focused on truth, and truth takes a backseat in the new stuff. So,
I agree,
yeah.
Jonathan. I think I had to reread this section to finally understand what he's saying about jazz, and actually through the whole thing in arts. And that's exactly his point: is that there becomes a lack of structure. Actually, what he says about jazz, I think, is a good compilation of all that. Page 78, jazz, by formally repudiating restraint by intellect, by expressing contempt and hostility toward our traditional society and mores, has destroyed this equilibrium. That destruction is a triumph of grotesque, even hysterical, emotion over propriety and reasonableness. Jazz often sounds in a rage to divest itself of anything that's just structure or confinement. And that seems to be his theme throughout all the arts, is this move away from what he had talked about in the earlier chapters, that's just expressing itself in a tangible way. When you guys were younger and playing at church and stuff, I mean, how many times did I have to try and deal with somebody on a praise team who want to be a rock star wannabe, in a little church? Yeah, that's exactly what he's talking about. And yeah, you really do see it in the rise in our society of complete egotism on the part of individuals. It's all about them. They don't want to submit to anything else. They don't want to be part of a structure.
Yeah. What's in your hand?
My hand?
Oh, that's okay. Because it's coming in like loud on the camera for some reason. I was like, what is that?
It's clicking.
It's a instrument of some kind.
Highlighter.
I put it away.
Probably. Yeah, we're all fidgety in my house. Let's go to the next chapter, because we're at this rate we're going to be here till like 11 p.m., which can't happen. So let's try to keep this one short if we can. But the Great Stereoptagon is chapter 5. Richard Weaver answers the question, how do you persuade men to communal activity without shared belief? Modern man does this by replacing religion with education through the Great Stereoptagon, which includes the press, the motion pictures, and radio. Man absorbs approved views through faith in the written word. People are exposed to this mechanism because of appetite and prevalence. The mechanism sensualizes to hold attention and is universally accessible. Truth and reason are devalued. Materialism is supported. Simultaneous perception of successive events is replaced with successive perception, which destroys reflection and emancipates people from memory and faith. Voters have shorter attention spans. Weaver predicted that the Stereoptagon would not forever unify different communities, since people would become more suspicious of propaganda and dissatisfied with the Stereoptagon's failure to satisfy. Now, I'll just briefly say this. This is an amazing prophecy that he makes here, that the Stereoptagon, being the media industries, the newspaper, television, radio, so this is pre-internet, it's 1948, he's saying, you have a multicultural community here. How do you keep them from dissolving? Because that's a big challenge, right? This is new. Modernity is new. All these people traveling from all over the world and settling with different religions and different habits and all the rest. And he says, well, this is the way that conformity or uniformity is maintained, is through these outlets, these media outlets. And what they do is they try to whet your appetite. That's the advertising, right? And they give you sensational news pieces that keep you glued to them. And it destroys memory. It destroys that reflective element that used to be there. And people are after something that stimulates them instead of something that causes them to reflect. So it's bad. Basically, he said it's bad. But the prophecy here is that though people are going to be bored with this, like or not bored, but they're gonna realize there's a failure to satisfy here. Like this. What the TV promises you, it can't deliver. What those advertisements tell you need won't actually give you satisfaction. And so, he didn't really say what was going to happen when people were dissatisfied, but I think the hope was that they would reject this and return to more reflective and sensible ways of living. So I'll just open it up. What did you guys think of this chapter? Either one.
I thought he had a lot of good insights. Obviously, he would like to see a change. When he's writing 1948, TV was something pretty novel for people. You know, what has happened now is, yeah, it's kind of fulfilled all the things he was talking about then. He goes pretty hard about after the newspapers, and some of that is the sensationalism. Uh, and he would like people to go back to something more reflective, but didn't think that was going to happen. He attacked radio as just incessant noise in people's ears, keeping them from being able to think. That's certainly prevalent now. TV, something's always on. There's always some noise coming in, coming where you're not thinking. You're never being quiet to think.
He sounds like an old man, though, saying, "Get off my lawn," right? That's how some people could probably take it.
Well, they might, but I think it has a lot more to do with the fact that people don't take the time to think. They're not trained to do that anymore. At least I don't see that. Their educational system is increasingly more with media related instead of reading and contemplating and thinking. They're not challenged to write like they would have. So people not being reflective is just whatever's coming in. And then there's such a massive amount of information dumped on you constantly. No, you're not going to remember, the scandals from last year because, well, you've got 24/7 scandals, coming up. What's the latest one? And it's always the newest talking point rather than dealing with issues that are more substantial than that.
Which is one of the reasons we're doing this, actually, because, if I just followed the news cycles all the time and just, hey, well, everyone's talking about it, so we have to talk about it. And that's it. And you never get to deeper foundational issues, then it's hard to progress in our understanding. And we just take every issue as if it's a self-contained issue, every issue by issue, instead of connecting them all into what's the position we should have, or what's the principle, I should say. We'll go back even before position. What's the principle that I should have that will navigate the way that I think and live? And that will then guide you as you're looking at a plethora of issues, not just the one. But it seems like today, every issue that comes up, and the news cycles are so short, they're like 6 hours, a poll's taken. Every news organization has a poll that's taken. What do the people think of this? What do they think now? What did they think 5 minutes ago? Oh, it's different. Look at the change. And that now is like what determines policies, even in this country. It's so unprincipled, and yet it's the way we live. And I think that's the great stereoptagon.
Well, there's an additional aspect to that stereoptagon. He has a good discussion of it in all its ranges, whether it's print media, radio, television, anything like that. Because underlying that also is coming a view from the business, newspaper, publisher, TV studio, radio program. They've got to keep an audience coming in order to generate revenue. So their means of production is to continually give you little tidbits and pull you into its cycle. We're certainly seeing the worst part of that now in the social media stuff like TikTok or well, even YouTube and stuff. There's always there's an algorithm always generating, here's the next one on the same subject, the next one. And
oh yeah,
and then they can lead you into something completely contrary to what you should be thinking about. Neil Postman, in his book "Amusing Ourselves to Death," written in the 70s, I think it was, he actually, you would have thought Richard Weaver would have written the two. Is Neil Postman's Weaver's son on this issue, because he pointed out the exact same thing. Yeah. And that's now a long time ago, and it's a whole lot worse now.
I'll say something quick about the Christian nationalist thing, because Weaver's whole deal here is that it seems like the effort, or it might not even be conscious, but what keeps society uniform to some extent, or on the same page culturally, which we can see is fragmenting now, is this great stereoptagon. I think this latest effort to craft some kind of a Christian nationalism, some kind of a Christian basis for the country, and it's of course very controversial and so forth. But I think what that is an attempt to replace the great stereoptagon. It's an attempt to say that there's something deeper that should bind us to each other, and something that even in a multicultural setting where people are different in many ways, at least there's a basic Christianity. That's at least the hope. That might be naive, but at least that's the hope, that there's a basic enough Christianity that we can have some kind of order, right? Because if we don't have anything that glues us together except, hey, we all like to be entertained by the same things, we all like driving nice cars, that is a recipe for disaster. And we're seeing it now. And I think Weaver kind of predicted this, that people would not forever be allayed by the stereoptagon. So, David, any thoughts before we go to the next chapter?
Yeah, just a white pill, which is unexpected coming from me. But so, and 98, page 9, towards the end of this chapter, he says there, towards the bottom of the page, if you're looking, following along, there are, it is true, certain hopeful signs of restiveness growing out of our condition. Most of us have observed among ordinary people a deep suspicion of propaganda since the First World War. So over Christmas, I was reading a book about the Christmas truce of 1914, and something hit me really hard that when I was going through this book and making parallels and comparisons to what we went through with COVID. And I feel like the First World War may be, in recent memory or semi-recent memory, one of the best comparison events, because you have basically mass propaganda on an insane level that falls on basically the entire world or large portions of the developed world virtually overnight. And you have this mass like mobilization and assembling of all these armies and everything, and pretty soon everybody's killing each other in Western Europe and Gallipoli and in the Middle East and even in Africa and on the high seas. And Russia plunges into a revolution. It's one of the largest events in human history. And then what's crazy is that a couple years later, it doesn't take long. And for reference, even Alvin York, who's the hero of World War I, even he was quoted by the 1930s saying I don't know why we did that. I don't know what the point of that was really. And you have a very similar, thing going on now, but people just kind of move on and they're like, well, that was crazy. And it's yeah, there's, 10 million less people on the planet now because we all,
more than that with Spanish flu. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just collective insanity. And then there was certain people who really benefited a lot from those events. So all that to say, that is not a white pill, but there is a white pill here because he says there is, because of these events, because of this going on, there's a certain quality of distrust that arises that actually makes people kind of wake up. So we've seen that now probably more than ever. I mean, I've made so many personal changes because of a distrust of the the authorities that are feeding me propaganda, because I realized over the last couple of years that I was being fed propaganda. And so you take something like health. So when you can't trust your doctors anymore, when you can't trust people giving you medical advice, then you start to actually take your own health seriously. So that's the I guess that would be the upside of the great stereo.
Yeah. That's good.
Because people reject it after a while. Not everybody, but
Well, you're seeing some of that rejection is the fact that there are alternative outlets for information, just like even what this is, too. The stereoptagon, he was also saying that there was, I'm not going to say a conspiracy, because there wasn't. I think there may be one now, but they all kind of work together. Page 97, he said the proprietors of the stereopticon have a pretty clear idea of the level at which thinking is safe for the established order. They're protecting a materialistic civilization growing more insecure and panicky as awareness filters through that is over an abyss. So we are seeing, some of that, and that's a good thing for alternative sources of information. And we have to support those things. Obviously, big tech companies and media, they're in cahoots with the Democratic Party and progressives, even within Republicans, they only want certain information out. And yeah, definitely we saw that in the COVID response. Only certain information is going to be allowed, otherwise you're canceled. The cancel culture is part of this.
Yeah.
So,
well, we got to move on to the next chapter to cover we'll see how far we get. I think we can do it. I really do. Chapter, let's see. We already did okay. We're up to chapter 6 now. The spoiled child psychology. Oh, this won't take long. This is so everyone knows that this is going on. And in ways now that I'm just amazed by. But Weaver argues that the recent prevalence of spoiled children is caused by a combination of factors relating to the rejection of transcendentals. All right. Remember, guys, whenever you hear transcendentals, we're talking about these universal absolutes that God has established that flow from him, many of them from his nature, etc. Well, Romanticism replaced discipline with indulgence. Urban living prevented children from experiencing forces outside of man's control and fostered a utopian notion that devalued the necessity of work. Faith in the achievements of science destroyed masculinity. This is 1948, right? The World War II guys have just gotten home, and he's like, yeah, masculinity's being destroyed. As a result, Weaver believed the Soviets were in a better position to triumph because they believed in ideals, while the West would spend more money on military and bureaucracy to encourage egotists. Weaver believed religion, which taught delayed gratification and living for ideals, was a necessary remedy. Children needed heroes who exemplified exertion, self-denial, and endurance. So this is a fascinating one because you see two things in this. Weaver makes a prediction. And in that prediction, he's somewhat wrong, right? The Soviets didn't actually win, technically, or did they? I mean, the Cold War, it fell. The Soviet Union fell, but we also have the fact that the communists now are in our own society. That this country that we have has kind of morphed into socialism, which, by the way, is one of those brilliant observation Weaver continually makes, is that finance, capitalism, and communism have certain things in common. And actually there is a progression that takes you from finance capitalism to communism. And he's very specific on what that finance capitalism is. It's not free market, guys. So if that's what you're thinking he's talking about, that's not exactly it.
no.
But and we'll talk about that maybe a little later. But he makes this prediction, and part of what he's saying though is actually right, that the West, this is exactly what the West is like today. We spend more money on the military. We spend tons of money. The benefits that you get now from joining the military, it's not about defending your country for most people that are joining. Probably it's, I don't want to smear the military, but I'm just saying that they have to make these huge incentives to get people to even sign up. We'll pay for all your college. We'll give you this $10,000 sign-on bonus. We'll do so many things for you. Because people they're not willing, I think, to go out and just. So there was actually a poll done. What if Russia invaded the United States? And it was for Gen Z. It was like less. I think it was like 75% said they wouldn't fight for America. It was crazy. I remember seeing this poll being like, "What in the world?" But because of that, you spend more money on the military, and you also spend more money on bureaucracy, and that's exactly what our budget's eaten up with today. So we're all spoiled children now. Like what he said came true, and here we are. And that's, I think, the fear that some have is like, well, if we've lost masculinity, and if it's all about ease and comfort, the Muslim world doesn't seem to have this as much, right?
Oh.
The communist world doesn't seem to have this quite as much, even though they're dealing with it too. So what does that mean? All right, well, let's open it up. Either of you, what do you think it means?
What do we think
what do you think?
The masculinity?
Yeah, well, Weaver's predictions, I think, on that front are correct, and we don't have the same kind of masculinity. Where do you see it? I guess twofold. Where do you see it manifesting itself, especially within the church? And then number two, where do you see the solution? Because Weaver gives a solution, but I don't know that it's the most practical. I don't think he intends for it to be practical. It's just, we need to get back to religion, which taught delayed gratification. In other words, he doesn't see a hope without getting back to Christianity. exertion, self-denial, endurance. We need heroes. If we don't have heroes anymore, really, not real heroes. So what?
Well,
How
the
do we get
willingness
back
to
to?
sacrifice. The willingness to sacrifice is part of what he talks about there. It was interesting what he said is we're spending a lot of money on military. Predicted we'd be doing that, but it's what are we defending? We're not defending our ideals. We're defending a comfort level, and that ends up how we end up reacting to these wars afterward. Is okay, we just return back to our comforts instead of recognizing we actually fought for ideals. There is something that we should be standing for, and that's part of the destruction of our own identity as a nation. What are we? I don't think most people can say that. But since you brought it up in the church, I do see the same thing happening. Is why are so many pastors afraid to preach what the scriptures say? And it's going to go back to is their people want to be comforted. They want to feel comfortable. They want to leave feeling like, God loves them. It's never going to correct them. It's not about them understanding who God is and aligning themselves with God. It's instead the message becomes God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life according to whatever it is that you desire. So we're going to morph God to your pleasures. That's why we've seen so many of the evangelical churches have gone into an entertainment mode. You have a stage up front. The audience is, it's darkened. You got spotlights up there. You got near professional singers, and the congregation is the ones who are doing the worship. It's supposedly the worship team up front. So that's all changed around, but all that goes back to comfort. The certain theological positions, the health, wealth, prosperity gospel has all been about comfort. And so what Weaver says here applies directly in the church on these areas. We're dealing with spoiled children in the church. So who's willing to sacrifice? Who's willing to give of themselves to help somebody else within the congregation who's got real troubles? What are you willing to do personally to go help people? And no, we have spoiled children. They want to come to the marketplace, the church. Who can give me the most satisfying experience for my time? Because I'm probably not going to give any money to them either.
Yeah, and the social gospel stuff is the same thing on a different level because it also reorients the mission or purpose of the church to fulfilling some kind of need that man has, instead of being kind of an outpost of heaven and a place you go to for spiritual help and consolation. It has to have a social utility to justify its existence.
Exactly.
Right? And that's why it's interesting that so many of the social justice type folks love to criticize the prosperity gospel and or the seeker sensitive movement, because they'll say, well, they were just focused on individuals. We should focus on the collective. And it's like, but both of you guys you're focused on man. You're not focused on God.
Exactly.
So, yeah, that's a good point though in the church. David, what do you think?
Well, you're talking about the church, so I'm thinking about like the cross section of kind of the big Eva narrative. So like, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I spent a few years going back and forth between here in Mozambique and South Africa, as like a short-term missionary, I guess. And, I was really excited and inspired by a lot of the kind of like David Platt radical kind of, I don't know, narratives that were kind of going on at the time. Don't Waste Your Life was like a big favorite book of mine and stuff. And when I came back to the States, I got really sick and I came back here, and I was sick for several years with like stomach issues, and I had back surgery and had a whole bunch of problems. And over that time, I kind of noticed that it just seemed like a lot of the people that seemed really amped up about, kind of like, we're going to go out and we're going to kind of conquer the world for Christ and all this stuff. Like everybody kind of did the same thing. They settled into suburban, neighborhoods and, got Netflix subscriptions and Hulu subscriptions and kind of worked for Verizon and for different corporations and stuff. And I got discouraged because I was like, what happened to this, kind of like, because at the time it did seem very manly, like, hey, something I aspired to as a man, and our heroes were, these missionaries. But, what you just said about heroes, I think is part of that. Like, most of our heroes have been assassinated. Would be the only hero we're really allowed to have anymore is Martin Luther King Jr., which is interesting. Like in the evangelical church,
Yeah.
so most of our characters have been assassinated. The people that we would look up to, the people that we would teach our children, like these are people worth emulating. And for like I guess kind of a dramatic example. So like right above me here at my desk, I have a portrait of General Charles Gordon, who was not Gordon Sanchez, Charles Gordon, who was a general in the British Army, and he basically like single-handedly crafted a defense of the city of Khartoum in the late 1880s. And the image is of him standing kind of like defiantly, and there's all these they were called Mahdists. They were basically Muslim terrorists, and they're getting ready to spear him to death. And he's just looking at them defiantly. So he's about to die. And, he was a very he was a very principled man. He had his flaws, but this is a man. So I had this image above me for years because I'm like, that's what I really want to aspire to. Well, I don't hear that at church, really. I don't hear things like that like men, go out and do manly things. And I think part of that would be who we aspire to be like in terms of heroes. And we need tangible heroes. We need flawed heroes. We need to, but we need people who are like worth emulating. And as an educator, I think that's a big thing for me. The other thing would be like, the lack of manliness. He talks a lot about comfort. So one thing that I was thinking about when I was reading chapter 6 that really, really terrified me and kind of creeped me out was so we're kind of addicted to comfort, and he mentions that where is that? It's in chapter 6. I had it written down. Basically the end of life is comfort, right? That's the whole purpose, kind of like you just said. And you think of that like in the context of COVID. So you imagine, the last couple of generations that we've had, your whole life has pretty much been about comfort. And that's been the chief aim, right? So you go to your job, you work so that you can have these material comforts. And like, how did your life end? If you were in your 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s, you got COVID and then you got pneumonia, and maybe you wound up in a hospital. And all throughout this time, even though you're kind of miserable, even though you're sick, you just keep getting like drugs and things to sedate you so that you're comfortable through this whole experience. And then at some point your soul disconnects from your body and you're dead, but you were comfortable. You had some like measure of comfort. The goal was comfort the entire time. There was never any connection to like pain, suffering, to let you know that you're alive. And I think that's like a gross example of kind of where we're at culturally, because we don't have connections to what makes life.
It's Soma, right? Is it Soma from Brave New World?
Yeah, we just take Soma.
Numb yourself. I'm going to go to John. So we have some folks in the StreamYard video chat. We'll get back to the book, but I want to go to one of the people who called in, John, and just see what's on his mind. John, can you hear me? We'll wait for John, see if he... I think sometimes people...
His mic is muted.
Oh, his mic. Did I mute his mic? Oh,
I don't know, but it looks like it's...
Can't unmute. Your guest needs to do it. All right. Well, John, I'm going to leave you in the chat for a moment. If you want to unmute your mic, I'll come back to you. So let's move on to the next chapter then while we're waiting for John. And let's talk about
property.
The last metaphysical right. Weaver argues that acceptance of the concept of private property with its self-justifying quality of hisness can serve as a defense against modernity. Weaver writes that property rests on pre-rational sentiments, in that we desire it not merely because it keeps the man up. This would reduce to utilitarianism, but because somehow it is needed to help him express his being. his true or personal being, by some mystery of imprint and assimilation, man becomes identified with his things, so that a forcible separation of the two seems like a breach in nature. Weaver believed finance capitalism, with its concept of abstract property, severs the relationship between man and his product, opening the door for degrading value and totalitarianism. He predicted that a rising police state integrated with big business would threaten the right to private property. In turn, men would lose character as communistic organization replaced man's responsibility to order his own house. Weaver advises a return to a belief in providence that would encourage responsibility and reduce the effects of statism. The moral solution, he says, is the distributive ownership of small properties. These take the form of independent farms, of local businesses, of homes owned by the occupants, where individual responsibility gives significance to prerogative over property. Weaver believed the world was starved for value and needed to return to honor and craftsmanship. There's so much to unpack here, and we won't have the time probably to do all of it, unfortunately. But let's start in with this. Weaver says that property, that there's no reason to justify it upon utilitarian grounds, which is one of the main issue I think that he keeps coming back to with nominalism, or this notion that there aren't these universal absolutes, these categories, these broad categories, these forms. He keeps coming back to everything then just gets reduced. Man gets reduced, work gets reduced. Reduced to what, though? It gets reduced to this pragmatic utilitarian, and he even brings in Darwin, I believe, in this chapter, Darwinian kind of notion of just it's survival, it's comfort, it's pleasure. These become the ends of life instead of, and these selfish things, instead of blessings that you experience along the way, but they're not means to ends, they're ends. And in this section on property, he's basically saying that there is this one area that we haven't completely abandoned yet. We've abandoned all these other areas, and we've just basically said, yeah, it's all about pleasure. It's really, there's nothing transcendent here. But he said with property, it's self-justifying. We don't have to argue based on utilitarianism. We don't have to say, well, it benefits us, therefore. He said, no, there's just this quality about it. The fact that it's yours means you're attached to it, means you have a right there, and the state can't impose itself onto that right. Now, here's the question I have is, what would he think if he were to live today and hear the World Economic Forum saying, you will own nothing and be happy? I was thinking about that the whole time, how prophetic, because he's concerned that big business and the state are going to merge together and create this nightmare, this police state that surveils you. He even gives the example of the New Deal and how the IRS was weaponized against political opponents of the Democrats. I was like, wow, that sounds awfully familiar. He's saying this in 1948. It's in one of the footnotes. And so he fears that this is going to happen. And we have lived to see the day that it's happening. And I am afraid to say that Weaver, what he was hoping would happen, which is that we would get back to this idea that there's providence, that God's given each person stuff to manage and to steward well, and there's a connection and then to the past. And you see this with Israel, where they had the land would return on the year of Jubilee to those who were the owners, and there was this connection there that Weaver wanted to restore. I think that's been abandoned to some extent. I think it's gotten a lot worse, is what I'm saying, because now we have the totalitarians telling us, why do you need to own anything? You'll be happy, right? You'll own nothing and be happy. That is such a mere, like a contradiction of what Weaver's saying. So I've talked a lot. Dad, what do you think?
Well, it goes back to what he was saying about the spoiled child and just wanting comfort. So if someone will take care of me, then it's fine. I don't need to own anything. I don't have to have the responsibilities. That's kind of what I kind of gathered out of that. When you own something, you're responsible for it, and whether you do well with it or not, you are still responsible. And he was actually putting out property rights as the last holdout of rights, and that's in 1948. He was recognizing that, and I do agree with you, Jonathan, that we've lost that. And it's not just what he had been saying about big business and government in cahoots with each other going that direction, or the Great Reset, but we've been losing property rights over the restrictions on what you can do with your property. Even in just the 30 years I've been here in Wappingers Falls, there have been so many new regulations added on what you can do with your own land that you end up being stifled, being able to do on your own land what you'd like to do with it. So, I mean, there's even improvements we'd like to make the property here. We're just not pursuing because it's such a hassle to go through the local government on it, and then they have to be hassled by state and federal authorities and all their restrictions. So it's more than just who owns it. It's, do you have even right to use it? So that last metaphysical right he was talking about, I agree with you, Jonathan. I think we've already lost it.
Yeah. Very sad. Hey, real quick before you go, Dave, John, can you hear me? All right. I think we're going to remove John from the stream. I'm sorry, John. I can't hear you, and it looks like your mic's muted. So if anyone else who's listening, who's a patron, wants to come into the stream and ask questions or make comments and just be part of the discussion, now is a good time to join, and I will let you in. All right, David, sorry to cut you off.
Well, he calls it the last he calls it the last metaphysical right. Well, you could also argue it's also, in some ways, the first metaphysical right, or one of the first, because Hebrew case law is kind of where we get the idea of private property to begin with. Most of our law code, if you march it back far enough, that's where you're going to get to. So it really is a biblical concept, private property. So it makes sense that that's what is being attacked, specifically to what you were saying about property in New York. So one of the reasons why we moved to another state was because of property taxes. Because when you're thinking about buying a home, if you're paying 13, 14, some people I know, $19,000, $20,000 in property tax a year, do you really own that land, or are you just permanently renting it? So I think you could argue in some ways that right in a majority, maybe even of this country, has already been kind of superseded. Another thing would be, like you're saying, what do you do on the land? So even here in Tennessee, if you want to milk your cows and then sell the milk, well, you can't do that. Now you can do it for pets. You're allowed to sell it to feed your dog, but you can't do it for human consumption. So even when you want to do things on your own land or do things with the land that you have, even in so-called like conservative red areas, you still have a lot of the same restrictions. So that right, and I mean, that's a small thing compared to, I want to put a shed up and I can't do that. But, that right is under direct assault in almost every area. And if you look at the trends in people living, I always think it's fascinating. Go on Google Earth and go to China and zoom into their rural areas. So you can't see a lot of like street view because China doesn't have a lot of street view, but you can go to the middle of nowhere, thousands of miles from Beijing, and you can zoom into nothing but fields of wheat. And in the middle of those fields, you'll see an apartment building, and everybody lives in that one apartment building, and there's maybe a restaurant and a gas station, but they're not living in farmhouses out in their fields. They're all living in one centrally controlled place, and that's the trend here too. We're just a lot more comfortable in the way that we do it. We have villages, or you might call Mick villages was what I heard one person call it. So, but it's still, I think it's still the same assault. It's very relevant.
Yeah. Good point. I'm gonna let we have someone who called in the last time coming back in. One of the patrons, Earl, is back in. I'm gonna add him to the stream. By the way, John, if you can hear me, I saw you came back in. Just start up your camera so I know you're there. But anyway, Earl, go for it.
Good evening, gentlemen. I'm dressed for company tonight, so I figured I'd turn the camera on. This has been a really, really fascinating and enjoyable discussion, and I'm learning a lot. This is a great book, and it's kind of scary how prophetic Richard Weaver really was. I guess my question had to do with both Weaver's view of work in the modern era and his thoughts on property ownership as kind of the last bastion of a pre-materialist civilization, or a pre-modern and anti-modern civilization. And the way you were discussing work and describing work as, it's something you do and it's not got a higher purpose. There's no real meaning to it beyond just getting the cash to pay for whatever it is you're trying to buy that week or that month. I think that ties in a lot to the kind of the anti-work movement. Have any of you heard of that?
I have. Yeah, I have heard of it.
We'll have time for more art.
Right. Define art.
Yeah.
But I've wondered a lot about that, because it seems like a lot of these anti-work people are talking about low-level cog in the machine, stocking shelves at a store for not much money, absurd turnover rates, people who don't show up for work and then you have to do their stuff on top of your own, and there's no real incentive or appreciation for that extra workload. And then combined with that, you have the real difficulty that a lot of younger people, millennials, Gen Z, have been having, dealing with exploding rent prices, the cost of housing, not being able to buy property and have property of their own. And I think some of that ties into the anti-work movement. If you're just living in your parents' basement and you're not really getting anywhere in life, why suffer through this low-level job with no way up or no way out if there's no hope for improvement materially on the back end, right? It's not like you can stay at the company and work your way up, or at least in their minds, it's not. You're not going to be able to save up and get a house and get married and have your kids and build your life that way. And I think a lot of this comes from hopelessness and despair, and not just laziness or egotism. I mean, I'm sure there's an element of that, but I think there's a genuine despair that a lot of this is rooted in.
Yeah.
Am I misreading that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not like one thing too, right? So many people will, even Weaver, he's tracing one thing out as far as he blames nominalism for where we are at, but there's converging forces in history. There always are. And I know what the movement you're talking about, it's among Gen Z specifically, and they don't think that they should have to work. So some of these low level workers, you're right. And I think there's a point to be made that if you're on this low level cog in the machine type stuff, and it's not a calling, I should say. There's no, you don't have that craftsmanship and that sense of purpose and calling in it, I guess. I keep using the same terms, I guess, but there's something beyond you that you're working for here. Then yeah, it takes all the pride out of it, and you don't pursue excellence anymore. And you're not, in many of these situations, your bosses, I think Weaver had a quote about, your boss is no better than you with the erosion of hierarchy. So it's like, I'm not going to work to make him look good. And everyone's kind of out for themselves.
Yeah.
And it's a dismal situation, but one of the things that I thought was really cool when I was reading this, a white pill moment, is there is this localist movement going on to try to kind of like return to the ways that our ancestors used to eat, to go to farm markets, to make local crafts. There's all these internet tools now that are connecting people, even locally, to for business endeavors. I'm kind of positive about that. I don't know what any of you guys think. I'll leave you in here for a second here, Earl, too, if you want to weigh in. But is that a solution, you think, to what Weaver's talking about? Because I know there's hippies involved in it, right? It's not all like right-leaning people at all, but like there's a localist, like Jeffersonian-ish almost thing going on. So
I think among the millennials, just really quick, I think among millennials especially, this is like becoming really, really big. So you do see it with more like urban dwelling, even left leaning, folks, especially younger people, because in the Hudson Valley where we're from, they'll come up from the city and pay like $700 to, collect some eggs and milk a cow for the weekend and like stay in a barn. So there's like this longing for real, this longing for authenticity. I feel like in the conservative movement, though, that's kind of the divide. That's the split. It's a split between, because people want to know what can I do? What action can I take? If we're not gonna, if we're not taking up arms to oppose the forces that are oppressing us, right? We're not. You're telling me all I can do is I can listen to the radio and then vote every 4 years. Like that's all I got. Okay. Well, I want something to do. Like I want actions to take. And so localism is an action. There are things that you can do. I can get raw milk. I can get raw eggs. Raw eggs. Don't eat them. Well, you could eat them, I guess. But, I want meat. That is, yeah. So I guess, Dad, you guys have kind of, been on top of that for a while, but
it's not a trend for him. Yeah.
Yeah. That's just
Well,
the way of living.
I'll admit part of that just comes from your grandfather's country roots, and spending time with relatives out in the country. You didn't think about you had a Sears catalog or a J.C. Whitney catalog or something like that, and you wait a long time to get anything. You didn't have this instant gratification, and you took pleasure in simple things. You had a purpose in whatever your work was, and even those in the low end of the totem pole, so to speak, on if they don't take pride in a proper pride in what they're doing because they're working for a greater purpose. What I tell people as a pastor, everything I do and everything you're supposed to do is for Christ. I don't care who signs your paycheck. You work for Christ. So you work unto him. But when it comes to buying local and everything else, there are deep roots. You don't find people in the country looking for everybody else to supply them. They're going to grow they're going to have chickens. They're going to have a cow. They're going to grow their own crops. They're going to at least have a garden. They're going to have something. They're going to exchange with their neighbors. And that was just something you always did. I grew this, you grew that. We'll make an exchange. And I'm glad I at least have a decent sized garden to be able to instill that into you, as well as that we should look to self-sustain, and we should buy local. Stay away from Amazon and all those. Stay away from these big corporations. Try to see if you can support someone local. Even if you pay more, it's better.
That would be something I'd love to explore more. We just don't have time right this second, I think. But that divide you talked about between conservatives right now, where on the right at least, where some are really in favor of like big companies doing what they want with their money, and even if they have a million lobbyists and perks and stuff, it's like, well, that's capitalism. Versus the proximity, valuing the proximity of those who are close to me. And I'm much more in that latter camp where Richard Weaver is. So anyway, anything quick to say there, Earl? Or
just the normalization of corruption, right? All the lobbyists. That's just business as usual, right?
Yeah,
that's a real problem. But you actually discussed localism, at least in some vein, with John Moody, the Tom Bombadil of that was a great episode. Yeah,
that was good.
I'll probably put some little clips of that out soon. But hey, thanks, Earl. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. God bless.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
So let's see here. All right. John is back. So we're going to bring him into the stream. John, can you hear me?
So got his
I can see a camera now. And I think maybe a palm over the camera there.
Microphone. There he is.
Yeah, is your microphone on?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear you now. You're
good.
You're like the blind man discussion. Jesus healed. I see men as trees, but
well, yeah, my camera's not working properly, but a fantastic discussion tonight, and thank you so much for sharing that information. I mean, it's just good to.
And I think we lost. Did we lose John?
Well, it froze.
I really wanted to know what he was saying. He was saying it's good too, and
Well, maybe you could put it in the comment section. We could read it.
yeah, John, if you're hearing this, man, I'm so sorry. I don't know. I mean, I think I have a good connection. I don't know if it's your connection or software. If you write a comment though on YouTube, I will go back and I will highlight it for everyone. So
you should be able to do it in the comment section.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. If you do it in the comment section too on StreamYard, I'll read it to everyone too. Yeah, I could do that too. You're right. The private chat. All right. Well, let's keep going here. We have two more chapters, and I think these will take a little shorter, if I'm not mistaken. We're gonna go to chapter 8, the power of the word. And this is where David, I'm just going to give it to David. I'll just read this and then you can talk. Weaver argues that language expresses transcendental categories of thought, not sensations. Today, ideas become psychological figments, psychological figments, and words become useful signs. The physical becomes the sole determinant of what is. As materialism grows and things are exalted, words are depressed. Semanticists fear the ability of words to express prejudice and therefore aim to dissolve form and thereby destroy inclination in the belief that the result will enable a scientific manipulation. This is part of a broader attack on symbolism, including things like flags and clothing. We must reject looseness and exaggeration and educate ourselves in literature and rhetoric and logic and dialectic. All right, David.
So one thing I would say about this is if you read this chapter and you're like, man, that's great, I want more. Read his most famous book, The Ethics of Rhetoric. You'll get multiple chapters of this, and you have to read it and reread it and reread it, and it's still kind of hard to understand. So yeah. So even I studied they called it critical literary theory. In college, and it was the class I had the hardest time with. So I also have, more difficulty with this chapter than many of the other ones. But so like trying to break it down into the most, simple concepts that are possible. So language transcends the physical, right? Because language is something that exists. It comes from the mind, right? And I feel like the best place to go is just like, what does it say in John 1, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So words have a way of conveying meaning that is transcendent of like the physical realm. So I think like at the baseline, that's kind of what he's getting to. Now, what will happen over time, and what we've kind of experienced in our own, recent history, is ownership of language becomes a mechanism of control. And for further reading on this, and maybe kind of a more simple, like expressed a little more simply, Politics in the English Language by who wrote George Orwell is a good essay to read, and he kind of gets into some similar themes. But can you throw that slide back up really quick? Because I just want to look at the last part. So, all right, rejecting looseness and exaggeration. So one practical example of this, right? Now, when you take a class in English literature, okay, you have to have a rudimentary understanding of the Bible, but you also have to have an understanding of Greek. Okay? So when you read even like early 1900 era texts, like modernist texts, you're still going to have all these references to biblical figures, and you'll have all these references to classical Greek mythology. And that's going to be true across the board with all sorts of different literary categories. Shakespeare is packed full. You basically have to have, if you're not familiar, you have to have a Bible and like the Iliad next to you to understand like half the references in his works. So one of the things Weeder is getting to is, so to have culture, you have to have this kind of like underlying literary understanding to give you common context. Right now, we don't have it anymore. It's kind of worn away. So we have simplistic expression of ideas, but we don't have that cultural commonality of literature, right? Or of logic, right? Logic is something kind of that has to be shared. We don't really have logic anymore. We live in a very illogical, society. So he's saying we have to get back to those things if there's any hope of stability or understanding one another. Now, the opposite of that, he's saying, is looseness and exaggeration. So the best example I can think of exaggeration or looseness would be like a word like literally. So literally now literally means figuratively. If I say I literally died, I literally mean that I figuratively died. Now that word is basically, it doesn't mean anything anymore. There's no agreement on what it means because somebody who is older and was used to that word having more of like a firm context or a firm specific meaning, they're gonna say, what are you saying? But the millennial or the Gen Z, they literally died. Literally, we all literally died. So that's kind of where looseness. Now that's like a kind of a funny example, but if you apply that to the realm of politics, then it gets scary because you'll hear, what did we hear? Another example. So when COVID kind of started, we heard stay safe. Stay safe. Everybody stay safe out there. Stay safe. So stay safe. When I say that over and over and over again, what does that mean to stay safe? Like, what is the context of staying safe? When would I say that to you? Well, I would probably say that to you when you're driving home. Staying safe has more of like a physical component to it. That's the semantic behind the word. That's kind of what it means. But when I say stay safe, I've now personified this like COVID virus to the point that now it is like physically after me. Stay safe out there. Because it would make more sense to say like, hey, stay healthy. Because that healthy carries more contextual capital than safe. So now I've basically like weaponized that word. I've used that word because of a looseness. I've allowed it to be I've allowed it to be used loosely, and now it's lost its real meaning and it's taken on a meaning that I assigned it. So what's the antidote? Well, we got to get back to a common literary logical framework.
You also have to fight that stuff when it comes up. When someone uses something like that, you have to fight it individually wherever it comes up. I remember even visit the doctor, and he said, "Stay safe." I said, "I'm not going to stay safe. I'm going to go live life."
Yeah.
You have to battle it, and are you going to be able to win back the word to what it was? No, but you still have to battle it. Otherwise, the more you lose the language, the more confusion there is. You can't communicate. And I do believe that is one of the strategies that our adversary, Satan, does have, is to destroy our ability to communicate the truth. I think Weaver would have actually had a little stronger case if he actually believed the scriptures. He quotes from John 1:1, but, throughout it, it's obvious he actually doesn't believe it is from God. It's inspired by God, and therefore it is something that we must learn from, and it stays the same. I spend my life translating and making sure the congregation understands the meaning of the original words when I'm explaining a text. And that's all kind of dealing with what Weaver's talking about here. I want to make sure I'm clear in what I'm saying. Otherwise, how would they know what God has said and not just me, pontificating of what I think at the moment? You don't need to hear musings from me. You need to hear the word of God. But that's true in all languages. If the word keeps changing meaning, it no longer communicates anything. You've lost it, and all you have now is confusion. And David's examples were good ones.
He roots this though in saying that it's an attack on symbols and meaning itself. It's the denial that these words signify anything more than a personal experience, and in the moment, right? And not even taking into account the ways of being that our ancestors shared with us, and they use these words to sometimes apply to similar experiences. We can't even really use them as an authority on the meaning of a word, because the word, there's so many examples of this. He uses democracy as an example. The word woke. It's ridiculous, but that's it's totally changed the meaning of that word, even the tense. But he says, I thought it was interesting. He talks about flags and dress. He says it's the same attack. And if you look at like on YouTube, there's these channels that'll show you Life in the 1800s is one of them. Everyone should subscribe to it because they show these really early silent film videos. And some of them, like one of them is from New York City. And it's so good because it's I forget, it's like not iron workers. It's like people working on the railway or something. They're all in suits, and they're dressed better than almost any of us, to go to church. And they're doing their day job. And he talked about how clothing expressed rank, how flags expressed like regional and
Alliances,
cultural significant things. And there's an attack on all of those things because there's bigotry embedded in them. And in our words, there's bigotry embedded. And so it's almost like this ritual of casting out the demons that the linguists have to. He doesn't call. No, they're not linguists. What does he call them? Man, I'm blanking on the word. I pull up the slide.
Semanticists.
Semanticists. Yeah, they go back and they to cast the demons out of these terms. They reappropriate them or they stop using certain terms and coin new ones and yeah, the effect is confusion, but the motivation, he says, is really an attack on objective truth, and that there's these broad categories of being that we can share with each other, and language just boils down now to individual experience. And yeah, it's just it's crazy because it seems so like you got to take 2 Advil to understand it because it's so abstract. But you see it playing out in our society in real time among people who don't even understand what Weaver's arguing, but they're playing along with this whole thing.
Yeah, the discussion may be abstract, but the reality of it is every day. Look what the we'll use the newer term, the woke people do with pronouns.
Yeah. Yeah, Yeah, that's actually a great example. Yeah, pronouns are even. You can't even.
The example.
It is the example. Yeah, and if Weaver lived to see this time, he'd be like, "I told you so." All right, we're gonna bring John back into the stream real quick, if that's all right, because John's back here. John, can you hear me now?
He's got his. There he goes.
Yes, I can hear you. I'm having some technical difficulty.
Yeah, I've been there. Sorry, we were hanging with bated breath for what you were saying earlier, and then you were cut off in the middle of the sentence.
Yeah, my phone died, but I just wanted to say how much I appreciate such a good and cultured conversation tonight.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that means a lot. Yeah, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Central Virginia.
Oh, okay. Well, I lived in Lynchburg for a while, so yeah. I do miss Virginia sometimes, but especially in the winter when it gets really cold. But it's actually been pretty mild here in New York this year. But
yeah, my daffodils are coming up. This is bad.
Yeah, I noticed the buds on the trees are starting near me. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's gonna drop down to single digits into the week.
Yeah, that's not good. That'll change things. Yeah, it was almost 50 today. But anyway, did you have any other? Do you have a question, John, or any comment you wanted to make?
No, I the discussion that you're talking about, the difference of words and things like that, simply, they did have to change the definition of vaccine, for example.
Yeah. Exactly right.
And all of these words keep changing, and it's basically to keep you off your point, right? So that if your communication means nothing, then it's just it's a piece of the truth wrapped in the lie, right?
Yeah. No, it's a good point. I know one of our the folks commenting right now on the YouTube asked a question that I think is really intriguing. They said, "Do you think biblical Christians will be the ones who are able to communicate effectively due to their common literary basis? Perhaps that's the strength of classical Christian education." That's an interesting thought, because we all have the book, right? We all have the Bible. We have a common tradition to appeal to. I'm wondering, though, if what Weaver's talking about here has made its way into Bible translations and into...
It has to some degree.
Well,
yeah, how so?
Bondservant.
Oh, yeah. We can't call people slaves.
The translation of, to make it more acceptable to your culture. And others, there are different ideas about how to translate. And that becomes a real problem. Not just, translating to English, we certainly have those, but you're in another culture, you're trying to get the first scripture out. How do you translate it?
Yeah. I know that I have a friend who was sitting next to, I don't even know if I want to say the organization because the arrows are going to come at me. It was a major, probably the major Bible translation ministry. And he was on a plane with this person, and they were sitting next to each other, and he started talking about social justice. And this guy was extremely progressive, and he's a translator though, and he was talking about how basically he wanted to change words or change the way certain words were translated to accommodate a social justice message, and was very blatant about it. And it just, I don't want to give any more detail to the story just because I don't want to smear a ministry that may be doing good work, but have a guy who's not great in the ranks. But it just amazed me. I'm like, really? I mean, the objective should just be, what is the closest approximate in the language to the original word? And because we're trying to convey a concept here, we're trying to convey something that we shared with the people back in those days, and not something novel in our own day.
Well, you do have, that's been going on for quite a while, even in English translations. The NIV had been their meta translation made it easy to read, not necessarily good for study, but then they wanted to change pronouns.
Yeah.
And that's even coming up in some of the more conservative translations. They want to change pronouns or add words to make it more acceptable to the current generation.
It's like when Tim Keller sees, I think it's mishpat for justice, and then is it Zadik for righteousness in the Old Testament. And he's like, if you see them together, you translate it social justice. It's like, what? So talk about taking a modern term that means a specific thing in our context, and then imposing that on the past. Well, hey, John, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it. So, well, let's keep going. Hannah Smith, you're on deck. I noticed you're there. Let's just go to the next chapter real quick, and then this is the last chapter: piety and justice. Weaver argues that piety toward nature, our fellow man, and the past should be restored as man puts himself in the place of God. A disrespect for nature manifested in things like belief in the equality of the sexes leads to tyranny and destruction. Weaver asks if we can restore civilization by accepting that one cannot obtain more than one puts in. Comfort is seductive and must cede to a sterner ideal, and duties must be accepted before freedoms. So I think in this final chapter, Weaver's main point, this is where he drives home the importance of boundaries. And I mean, he's been doing that the whole book, but in this particular chapter, I think he's very direct about this whole issue. And he basically indicts modern man for thinking that they can or should manipulate nature. And he uses actually the Manhattan Project as an example of this, but that it's only there for us to use and to, well, there's no barrier, I should say. There's no respect. There's no barrier that one must not cross. We're seeing that now with transgender surgeries. If Weaver could only live to see it, that there's no respect for order anymore in nature, and that we need to conform to the order that God has put there. And so it's, how do we manipulate things to conform to our imaginations, our desires, right? And so, he gives example here, and it's a fascinating example. Again, it could have been written yesterday, but he says this notion of the equality of the sexes, that women are the same as men in every respect. He goes, that just leads to tyranny and destruction. It's like, well, man, that's exactly what we're seeing. He wrote this in 1948. This is right after World War II, and he's saying he's already seeing this. I'll pitch it to either of you, and then we'll bring Hannah in. But what stood out to you about this chapter? Because this is his clarion call at the end to something applicable. And I would say for those looking for application, he doesn't give much. He gives a little, but it's more of like, guys, we gotta get back to the things that are rooted. So yeah, what do you think?
I kind of agree where his conclusions go to, though I have to point out he does not have the biblical understanding of creation. Um, we do have a mandate given by God on our responsibilities over creation. I think he gives good warning about the exploitation and the idea that man can play the role of God. That part, I think, is really good, and I agree with that. His conclusions at it, but he'd have a stronger case if he actually, I think, believed the scriptures.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what makes you think he doesn't believe. I mean, he's not a uh,
Well,
he's not a born again Christian, right?
it's
But
on page 155. Even the violence belief that creation or nature is fundamentally good, the ultimate reason
oh
for
yeah,
the
yeah.
cause of the mystery. So he has a flaw in his thinking, and it kind of goes throughout the book. And he'd actually make a much stronger case if he actually did believe the scriptures and built off of that. But
Because when I read that too, and I thought what he was saying was that there's a good order to creation, that the intention, God created it good, but I think what you're saying is that because he's right about that, there is this order to creation,
correct.
but that there's been a fall, and I know Weaver acknowledges a fall. That's one of the main bases for his political sentiments, is that man, because he doesn't like optimism, he doesn't like thinking too much of man, because man's corrupt. But you might be right that he exempts creation from that corruptness to some extent. Maybe, I don't
Well,
know.
it came out a couple other places in the book. I don't know where he actually stands on it, but he seemed to give kind of a path to evolution, things like that. And my point really is something I actually said last week too. Is um, I find he's a very good writer. I find it's what he says are things you really do need to think about. Both of you boys uh, attested to how much he helped you and your thinking. I'm just saying is that because he's not there from a biblical standpoint, his case is weaker than he would have made if he actually believed those things. And that is true here when it comes to piety and justice and his writings on that and where he goes with it. His conclusion is a good one, and we do need to stand against it. And he correctly points out, man, well, he doesn't point out this way, but man is not God.
Right.
And we need to recognize that he calls it a mystery, but God has already told us exactly where it comes from. He created it.
Yeah.
And, we are those who are trying to understand God and the world he's created. The homeschool groups that we've, in the current one that's kind of what we keep pushing. We want the children to understand God according to how he's created it, and then go from there, because that is what he's been calling transcendental. God's created, he has an order, there is a hierarchy, man has a role that God has given to us in creation as well as within our social relationships. He's described those things. Those are things that are going to those are the only places that you're going to find hope for any kind of recovery, is bringing people back to these basic truths. So he is taking it from a philosophical side, and he ends up with the same conclusion, because the reality is, man is fallen into sin, or fallen. He's not perfect, and man is, because of his corruption, is going to mess things up.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I would agree that he keeps coming back to essentially what a restoration in belief in God and living in his world and Christianity would accomplish. I think the overturning of the modernity that he's writing against. Hannah, are you in the chat? Hey.
I'm here.
Yeah, well, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you all.
Yeah, and I've noticed something that it's the second time I've done this, right? And it's mostly the same people who and of all the people who could participate, I think it's the brave people who don't mind letting people see their face on camera publicly. So
yeah,
you're one of those
it's a
brave
mistake,
people.
but oh well.
So what's on your mind?
Well, the last chapter made me think, have any of you read Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book?
How to read
No.
it? Oh, I've
been
heard
meaning
of
to
it.
read that because I want to know how to read books.
I know. I really wish I read it before college, but he was one of the kind of, I guess, starters of the great books of the Western tradition. And he wrote this book, I think originally in like 50s or 60s, and it was updated in the 70s. But his whole premise was that our literacy rates were going up and the quality of our literacy was going down. And he used like very specific metrics by which we should judge writing and our own reading comprehension. But I think he also, because obviously as one of the, collaborators in the books of the Great Western tradition, he also believed in having a common literary heritage. So that might be interesting further reading.
That's a fascinating point. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Weaver I was reading who was kind of mocking this idea that with more literacy comes more moral sophistication and knowledge.
Yes.
And
and more Adler talks about, Adler's not a Christian. He's Jewish, but he I think like an atheist Jewish even, but he made a similar point. I think you're right. I think Weaver was a little bit more condescending about it. But Adler was more, I think, more descriptive, at least briefly. He didn't go into as much depth because the whole point of this particular book is obviously to help people to rise to the level of the great authors. And one of the things that I really appreciated about it was he talked about criticism, and he talked about how today, and this was again back in like the 40s and then the 70s, how criticism is seen as a negative. And he talked about how actually criticism needs to have, like, it has both positive and negative qualities, and even neutral. Like if you don't know, if you're unsure, that is a criticism as well. But you also need to reassess if your ignorance is your fault, or not, right? Or if you haven't been able to make a decision. But regardless of like where your neutrality is, you should be able to explain why you are neutral in that issue and what questions you have further, as opposed to just kind of letting like neutrality be your virtue. So a lot of interesting stuff like that. I think it definitely.
So you're saying you want the next book that I discussed to be how to read a book?
Well, I wouldn't mind reading it again, but no, I mean, I definitely think anyone who's interested on that topic should read it. And if you want to add it to the list, it's definitely worthy. And it goes nicely with that idea. I guess a question I would have more along the last chapter and the conversation you were just having. In terms of piety and moving forward and starting to think of building and not just responding, I think a lot of people are kind of in that place where, okay, we want to build systems, or we want to build relationships or communities that are more generationally focused and not just responding to our current generation. And I think that's a good thing, but it also seems that a lot of different denominations, different sects are focusing on eschatology and saying, that is the main reason why.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's accurate? I mean, I definitely think it contributes. I know myself, I'm still kind of undecided.
I'm trying to. I don't know how to articulate it. I know what you're. How are you connecting it though? How can you articulate that for me?
The post mills. It's the post mills. That's what
we're talking about post mill people who are like fastidious and like.
Well, I've heard it on different sides. I would say mostly I've heard it on pre mill and post mill. A mill, they're more the neutral ground, I guess.
They're
like, we transcend this debate. We transcend this argument.
They're like, what is an apple? No.
I've heard it from both sides. But I think it does. Personally, I was kind of raised Reformed, but also had a pre-mill dispute background. So I wasn't even kind of clear where the lines were, but I realized even just understanding of covenant theology and how that influences your eschatology. But I do think even Weaver's point, his whole point in the beginning was that we don't have a common view of human destiny, right? So that made me think of it. And then it does seem to be coming up now. And I think some of that is people are attributing some of the decay in our culture to views on the end times. So the Reformed people will kind of accuse the, pre-dispensationalists of just trying to get everyone in the lifeboats and not really care about what we build, just let the ship sink. And then, maybe the the pre-mill people will kind of blame the more Reformed people. And I know Reformed is beyond eschatology, like it's more post-mill, I guess, a-mill types on not doing enough evangelism. Or so that's one area that's like the more obvious, but I'm curious if you can think of other areas that it might affect, because it does seem to be something that people are pushing more, and it also complements what we were saying.
And by pushing, you're talking about like practical ways of, like applying,
having a unified eschatology, and then applying it in our daily lives.
Like, what does that mean practically for how we live?
Right. And how important is it that we, as like an American church, have a unified eschatology?
So,
when the rapture happens, everyone's going to know.
The thing is, what Weaver's talking about, though, is the denial that there's even a telos, like there's not a purpose. So we create our own purpose, and it becomes utilitarian. So it's man-centered. So you're talking about something, though, a little different. I think you're talking about like the different flavors of trying to make sense of what Revelation's teaching, and no matter what flavor you pick, we're all heading towards the consummation of all things. And so Christians are already broadly united. We know there's going to be an eternal state. There's going to be a heaven and hell, new heavens, new earth. So I don't know what Weaver would say, but I would think if he understood all of that, he would say, well, that's, these are not significant differences as it pertains to our destiny and where we're headed. The thing, though, that you said that made me think, oh, wow, though, this is a good point, is that I have run into people who seem to think, for some reason, they oversimplify. They think that as you said, it's your eschatological view that determines everything else, your specific eschatological view. And it's not that those things aren't determinative to some extent. Like I'm sure they do affect you, but I pointed out to some hardcore post-mill guys, I'm like, look, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson have done more in the last 40 years for Christians engaging the political realm than anyone else, probably. Francis Schaeffer may be in there, and his eschatology was probably more covenantal, but those two were dispensational pre-mill guys. Yeah. So I'm just like, I don't know that it's not determinative in my mind, because even the dispensational premillennialist who thinks a rapture's coming still doesn't know when that's going to happen, and is still trying to be a good steward. It's an ethics issue, not eschatology. They're trying to steward what they have right now well. And so it's what I find, I guess, interesting, though, is the fracturing of even the church right now, that there's a lot of different factions who think that sometimes slight variations give them the whole key, right? The key to understanding the return to Christendom, or to the overturning of secularism, or all these maladies we have. It's like, well, we have the key over here, and it's pre-mill, or we have the key over here. And it's usually something that's like
baptism
on the periphery, right? Baptize your babies. You're not baptizing your babies, and that, and then they'll become transgender. I know. Anyway, I'm kidding.
I set you up. That's okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's like, but there's really basic core things here, like fundamental things that all Christians should share in common, that would overturn the secularism we're in. Just believing there's a God who's spoken transcendently, given us barriers and laws and responsibilities, and that's what we were saying has been lost. And but I do find that fascinating, though, because you brought it up in a way that I haven't really thought about it as deeply, that it is these kind of periphery or niche things, brand things, right? That people think are going to be that they're the key that fits the whole, that will overturn all the evil around us. Like, I don't know what anyone else thinks of that, or if.
Well, I mean, I feel like, I would have considered myself part of the young, restless, reformed kind of contingent when I was, back in my
Oh,
young
Gordon.
Who's that? He's still there. He's not super, he's not super young anymore, but he's pretty rough for him. But I remember just being like incredibly disappointed because I thought it was we're going to go take the world for Christ kind of thing. And then in 2018, after a series of conferences that centered around like social justice issues, it was like, wait, you guys are all just saying what like I'm hearing in college at like my extraordinarily liberal college. You guys, I really thought that the only important thing was you had to believe that, that salvation was predeterminative, right? You had to believe that you had to believe in predestination. If you believe that, man, everything else is going to fall into place. Like that is the linchpin. That's the one thing. That's the key. And that's how I would have judged pretty much every teacher I listened to. Everything else, but like this particular thing, that's the thing that you need. And then I watched pretty much every, with a few exceptions, pretty much every teacher that I really latched onto and
Y'all went woke.
Model go woke and like completely like subserve those same principles and actually really undermine that doctrine. So, like, okay, all right. So that wasn't clearly there was more going on than just that doctrine.
Yeah.
And we can't make anti-wokeness the barometer either. Although I think that is a barometer. Like, are you willing to stand against this evil movement? It can't be the one thing we're like, well, he's not woke, therefore this is, I think, what's getting people in trouble right now. And I guess I'll just say it. And I'm going to say it as carefully as I can. But with this whole thing with James Lindsay last week, some of you might know I'm talking about, some of you don't. Praise God that there's an atheist who, and someone, by the way, told me he's agnostic. So I don't know whether, but he seems to be okay being called an atheist online. So whether he's atheist or agnostic, he's not a Christian, right? He's not a believer. And he's done some great work on identifying the issues with critical race theory and a number of other things that are happening right now. And that's great, right? We can glean from that. We can glean from Richard Weaver, even though he was not a born again Christian. At least there's not evidence that he was. However, because, James Lindsay is against social justice, I saw some Christians really excusing things that he was horrible things, in my opinion, things he was saying that were just raunchy and terrible, because, well, he's against our enemies, though, right? And I think we got to be careful of that with Joe Rogan and with Bill Maher and with Jordan Peterson and with, the list just goes on and on with all these guys who are more kind of, actually, they were on the left like 10 years ago, and they still would be, except for the left's gone, more left. And they become rock stars on the right for some reason, because they're brave enough, I guess, to disagree with some current initiative that the modern left, innovation the left wants to foist on us. And we just have to be so careful not to just follow someone full, speed ahead, justify their actions, make them our guru, just because, well, they agree with us on this one point we feel strongly about. Because in 10 years, things may change. Other issues may become also very important. And, that person may, that movement even you might have been part of, was insufficient. And so I would just say we have one sufficient authority, right? That is the word of God. And that's where we have to constantly be going back to. And the people who imbibe that the deepest are wise people. And that's who we should make our role models. So, yeah. Anyway, I went off on a rant because you brought that up, but I'm glad you did. So, yeah, thank you.
The enemy of my enemy is a co-belligerent, not necessarily my friend.
Right.
Yeah.
Something that did kind of change it. You still see it with some, especially among those who actually are fundamentalists, true fundamentalists, not what they've been called. MacArthur would be in that camp. We recognize that, and I would be in that camp. We recognize that I don't have to agree with another believer on every point, including my eschatology, other than the fact that they also believe in a physical return of Jesus, and there's the end point. Yeah. We recognize there is a purpose in my life that transcends the here and now for a purpose that is going to be eternal. And I think that may be what Weaver's really getting at, is there is an eternal purpose to our existence, not just the here and now. And man thinking that he can control everything in the immediate present he makes a lot of serious errors. That's where the mRNA vaccine mess has led us. We think we're going to be God, and we forget that there is an end that transcends all these things. So we had all sorts of people dying alone in hospitals rather than being comforted by having their family there to pray with them and encourage them and hold their hand. You know, we were not gods. We're looking forward to what God has. And when it comes to eschatology, if that is kept in mind, that even whether it's all-mill, pre-mill, or post-mill, we are all holding fast to a physical return of Christ, and that there is a consummation of the ages, then we will be able to work together. If we end up fighting in an improper way about those issues, and I will fight for a pre-trib, pre-mill position, but I'm not going to be obnoxious about it. I'm just going to keep going back to scriptures, which is what I'd want anybody who have a different eschatology to do the same thing with me. Is, well, what does scripture say? You know, that's what we're after. But when it comes to what Weaver's talking about culturally, we're looking for an endpoint. The endpoint is Christ's return,
which Weaver doesn't ever talk about.
No,
but he is looking for an endpoint, and it's not something here.
Yeah, he just the idea that there's another world that we should be ordering ourselves in the light of is just
that's his point.
That we're down to such fundamental, basic things right now.
Yeah.
But it's we've been going now over 2 hours on the live stream, almost 2 hours in 2 minutes here soon. So we're gonna say bye to Hannah. Thanks, Hannah.
Good night.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I would say final thoughts, but I think I'm shot. So I just want to say thank you for participating in the discussion, everyone who's commenting, and also Dad and David and everyone who called in. And let's see, we have. I'm seeing if one person's going to come in here. If it's got to be quick if they do. Okay, so they're not going to come in. All right. Well, yeah, thank you once again. And for those who are looking to read this book, I would suggest getting a hard copy if you can and taking it slow. It's a good book just to understand the times we live in. And I think it'll open your eyes to some extent. Next books that we might do, I'm not sure yet, because I think some people have emailed me. They've said they've really liked this. And maybe we'll take a step down, not so philosophical, maybe something else. I haven't decided yet. But
Dave and I would go for something historical.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of how could we do a biography, but I'm like, how would we discuss a biography? That's, I don't know.
Easy.
Like, you think it's easy?
Easy.
Maybe a classical
Love and
piece
Hate
of
in
literature.
Jamestown, the island at the center of the world.
Yeah. Well, that's a little too involved. Yeah, we'll figure something out though. If you have a suggestion for a book, please put it in the comment section. Let us know what book you'd like. That's meant a lot to you. One of the ones, I'll just tell you this, that I was leaning towards, and I don't know if we'll do it, is How Shall We Then Live? It is not as dense as Weaver at all. And I've read it a few times, and I think it's also, though, very formative and very good. Now there might be some things I might even disagree with a little bit on it. I'm not sure yet. I have to read it again, but because I've changed a little since I read it the last time. But I still think it's a great book, and that might be a good one to go over. Well, that's a wrap. Hey, thanks once again, everyone. God bless. I hope you have a good evening. Bye now.